And here is our main news this morning. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, reportedly under pressure to give millions of teachers and NHS workers bigger pay rises than were planned. According to The Times this morning, the independent pay review body is said to be recommending salary hikes of up to nearly 4% in some cases. That is a move which would cost billions more to stretched public finances.
And, of course, that raises fears of redundancies, of cuts to services, even so-called summer strikes. And our political correspondent, Louisa James, is at Westminster. Louisa, these figures aren't yet officially announced. It's a Times report of what they think the pay review body is going to recommend, the independent pay review body. Is it accurate? And will the government think this is good news or more difficult news?
Well, yeah, it would be a huge headache, wouldn't it, for Rachel Reeves, who we already know is struggling to balance the books. We're constantly being told that there's no money to play with, there's no money around. And so, yes, if it turns out that there is, as the Times is reporting this morning, a huge gap when it comes to these public sector pay rises, that would be another big problem for her to deal with. Let's take a look at the figures that the Times is reporting this morning, because what it is saying is that while government departments have been planning for pay rises of 2.8% for public sector workers like teachers and nurses, that the recommended pay rise, which is being put forward by the independent bodies that looks at this, is much higher. For NHS workers, actually around 3%, and for teachers, closer to 4%. Now, when we asked the Treasury about this, they told us that the process is still ongoing, and they reminded us that last year, the Labour government did accept the pay review body's recommendations in full. But even if that does happen again, the unions may not be happy with those pay rises. And the other big issue is that those rises may not be fully funded by government, which means that schools and hospitals and so on would have to find some of that increase from their existing budget, something that they are very unhappy about. Now, all of this raises the possibility, as you say, of strikes. That's something the government has already been dealing with in Birmingham over bins. The National Education Union has told us this morning that it is ready to take industrial action if necessary. The Royal College of Nursing in December called that 2.8% figure deeply offensive. And of course, we're talking about all this in a hugely important week for all the political parties, with the local elections on Thursday, the first ballot box test of how voters are feeling since the general election last year.
Right. What sort of an issue does the Labour government have with the unions, where the Times has been told that the independent pay review body representing teachers and NHS workers is recommending pay rises much higher than that the government has budgeted for? Now, when the Labour government came into power, they struck a deal, didn't they, over NHS pay for some workers, which was seen, you know, as one of the things that they trumpeted as one of their first successes to call off strikes. Now they face strikes again. Is this likely to happen, do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, they were the pay review body reports they inherited from the Conservatives. They'd been gathering dust and they implemented them. And I think it was 4.5%, 5% around the time. Yeah. If you set up an independent
train drivers got 15% over 3 years.
Over 3 years, which is below inflation, because inflation was more than 11.1% in one of those years. And the train dispute was really about terms and conditions and how you work. But they're stuck, because if you have an independent system, you say it's an independent system, both sides give all their evidence, and then the experts decide what you're worth. They do issues like recruitment, retention, motivating, and they come up with a figure. It is very hard for a government to go back on those figures. Average wages at the moment are nearly at 5.9 in the private sector.
The truth is, Kevin, I mean...
So they're below... inflation is 2.6, going to go over 3. It's not big increases.
If the government was planning on 2.8%, they were never going to get 2.8%.
No.
The pay review bodies were always... given inflation is still above target, the pay review bodies were always going to come in between 3, 4, could have been slightly higher. These seem to me to be very reasonable recommendations for the independent pay review.
But not ones that the government has budgeted for.
Well, I know, but I think that's because they budgeted very tight.
And inflation is going to go up this summer. Yeah. It's going to go higher, because of energy costs and other factors.
Tariffs from Donald Trump.
But if you...
So we've already seen the National Education Union, the biggest teachers' union, is already limbering up potentially for strike action, which would be a disaster for a Labour government.
The issue is not going to be strikes. The issue is going to be that individual departments are told you've got to pay 4%, but we're only giving you 2.8%, and that is
it's
a bigger squeeze on the services.
If a school is given 2.8% to pay, and then it's told you're going to have to pay close on 4%, well, where's the other 1% or so going to come from? It's going to come from existing budgets. So is there going to be fewer books? Are you going to have fewer staff? Are you going to have to cut back on maintenance? Are you not going to be buying new equipment? And same across the NHS. But the teachers and the NHS staff are worth those increases. When you look at what's happening, they're below what's happening in average wages, and inflation is going to go 3.2%, I think, is the forecast of averaging next year. So you're not going to get a big increase in your standard of living. You're really basically going to be treading water.
Yeah, and if these pay rises are not honoured, the issue is, do NHS staff go on strike? Do teachers go on strike? We know that when NHS staff go on strike, waiting lists go up.
Yeah, I've covered the world of pay negotiations for decades, and you get more threats of strikes than you ever get strikes. But there were strikes towards the end of the Conservative period, and it was in response, really, because inflation went up to 11.1%. It's 2.6 now. People's standards of living were going backwards, so, of course, they wanted to stand up for themselves and try and improve their position.
Politically,
they are a threat.
Catastrophic for a Labour government to have strikes in the NHS. A Labour government that came in, they're going to fix the NHS on the side of the doctors, on the side of the nurses. It would be so much more politically difficult for a Labour government.
And of course, why they won't reject these pay review bodies.
No,
they'll pay them.
But if you're
have to find money, the chance to find the money somewhere else, which means more borrowing or higher taxes.
But if you're a union negotiator for these groups of workers, you will know you've got some punch. But if you've bought into the peer review system and you expect the government to honour those awards, then aren't you really in a position that you should then accept them because you've bought into the system?
So, Kevin,
if you're not in the system, it's different.
So
but if you're in the system,
where will the money come from then in order to pay this increase to those workers? Because there's no doubt they deserve them.
Yeah.
And the government will probably agree to that. But they've already made a cut, obviously, to pensioners with the winter fuel allowance. They've made a cut to those with disabilities and benefits. Are they going to increase the amount they borrow? Is that what Rachel Reeves will do? Or is she going to contemplate another tax rise?
I think what she'll do is she'll sweat the budgets in those departments. And
so just cuts.
So, yeah, you'll squeeze the budget. And so something else will have to give. Maybe a school somewhere won't get a new roof. Maybe hospital equipment will be slower. I just can't see her increasing those departmental budgets, either borrowing, as you say, or...
But the Labour government is also behind better public services and investing in public services. So if people at the next election believe that their public services have suffered under a Labour government, that comes back to bite them. And in fact, in local elections as well.
Yeah, absolutely right.
But maybe you slow the rate of improvement.
Well, she will think...
Which is what? But you look at the NHS, it's getting better.
She could
waiting lists have fallen for 6 successive months. It's still incredibly high.
They could save £22 billion by abandoning this nonsense carbon capture scheme. An untried and untested technology. Get rid of it. £22 billion. That should be spent on our schools and on our hospitals.
Right.
The Chancellor will think the way she can get out of this, it's very hard this year, is to get the economy to grow more.
Oh, that's going to go well.
And if you look at the two things she was saying...
rises, Ed.
And if you look at the two things she was saying on Friday, when she was out in Washington, she said, our trade with the European Union is much more important than our trade with America. What does that suggest about their attitudes to Europe? She said that she wants a new youth workers scheme for young people to come and work here. The Treasury will be thinking more people coming into our country means more people working, means more growth in the economy, more tax revenue, rather in contradiction to the front page of the Daily Telegraph that Susanna was reading out a moment ago. I mean, there will be an argument in the government between those people saying control migration and those people saying, actually, helps you with growth and taxes.
Well, they could also, or they could perhaps get people who are on benefits here to get to work. We've got, 10.5 million people still not working. Why do we need a great influx of young people from Europe to do these jobs?
But that's 10.5 million.
800,000 between the ages of 18 and 25, 880,000, not active economically in training. Get them off their backsides and into work.
That 10.5 million figure you use includes people who are at home looking after their kids, includes students, includes people who are retired
There's
early.
people
So
to
let's
do the
not
jobs.
use,
We don't
let's
need
not
to
use
start free
that
movement
figure.
of people all over
You're just
again.
trying to create
It's
the impression.
free movement of people by the back door.
You're trying to create the impression
Free
again.
movement
Britain
of
is
people
a
by the
nation
back
of malingerers.
door. There are a lot of malingerers, yeah. I'm
Britain
right.
is a nation
Spot on.
of grafters.
There's a lot of malingerers.
And, right. Good morning, Britain. Our main news this morning, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves is reportedly under pressure to give millions of teachers and NHS workers bigger pay rises than planned. According to The Times this morning, the independent pay review body is said to be recommending salary hikes of up to nearly 4% in some cases, a move which would cost billions more to stretched public finances.
It raises fears of redundancies, cuts to services, even so-called summer strikes. And our political correspondent, Louisa James, is down at Westminster. Louisa, these aren't official figures announced by the government yet, but if they're accurate, is it good news for the government? Got decent pay rises, or is this a budgetary problem for the Treasury?
Well, it would certainly be a financial headache for Rachel Reeves, wouldn't it, to have to find more money when we know, as she keeps telling us, that there's not much money to play with and finances are very tight. Because, yes, The Times is reporting this morning that there is a significant gap when it comes to pay rises for public sector workers like teachers and nurses between what the Treasury has budgeted for and what independent pay bodies are recommending. Let's take a look at the figures that they are reporting this morning. So they are saying that while government departments have been planning for pay rises of 2.8%, that the recommended reported pay rise for NHS workers is actually around 3%, and for teachers it is closer to 4%. Now, when we asked the Treasury about this, they told us that the process is still ongoing, and they reminded us that last year the Labour government did accept the pay review body's recommendations in full. But even if that does happen again, it's possible that unions won't be happy with those figures. That is what they are suggesting at the moment. And another big issue is that because finances are so tight, and there's more news this morning about how much of an effect Donald Trump's tariffs are going to have on the UK economy, the government might decide not to fully fund those pay rises. And what that means is that schools and hospitals and so on have to find some of the funding for it from their own budgets.
This government was elected on the promise of change, of recruiting 6,500 new teachers. The ball is in this government's court. They need to ensure that the pay award is above inflation, that it takes steps to address the crisis in recruitment and retention, but most importantly, that it's fully funded. No one wants to take strike action. But of course, as a trade union, we do stand ready to act industrially if we need to.
Well, if those reports are to believe, then it looks as though neither of those union demands could be met, meaning strike action does feel like a real possibility. The Labour government are already dealing with strike action in Birmingham over bins, and then you've got the nursing union as well talking about possible industrial action over these pay rises.